In this video, we will explain the whole financial meltdown Greece has been experiencing throughout the past years. Since Greece is a part of the Eurozone, its economic issues do not remain solely on the Greece territory, but concern every member of the European Union. When Greece became a member of the Eurozone, it obtained legitimacy in its global markets, but it is essential to understand that it is difficult to manage different economies based on the same currency, which is what Greece is dealing with. It is essential to understand that Greece has a problem in every one of its administration. They don't show the true figures of deficit, so people were having a false sense of relief when they joined the Eurozone, thinking that their budget was in check, when it really wasn't. The government continued to manage the country as if everything was okay. But one of the main problems, which we will highlight in this video, is the fact that the public sector wages rose more than the private sector paycheck, and what we believe is the main problem are that pension spending went up. All this with the fact that Greece has a tendency to avoid taxes went out of control when the global financial crisis hit in 2008. We will then proceed to explain how Greece has received several bailouts when they realized they were in so much debt and had to ask the Troika for help. The Troika is consisted of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the European Central Bank, plus a series of Euro member countries. The Troika helped Greece by giving it bailouts, but with conditions that Greece had to get their act together with measurements like pension cuts and tax hikes. Greece is currently struggling with the pension reform because it will be really difficult for people if it takes place since a lot of people in Greece depend on pensions to live. Even the Prime Minister knows it is a hard step, but it is probably the hard step Greece has to take. We believe there is no room for fiscal policy. When we explain this in the video, you will understand why fiscal policy is not a viable option for Greece, since it does not depend only on themselves. Also, the so-called Grexit, which is Greece leaving the Eurozone, doesn't sound profitable and it would take much more effort than what it would eventually reward Greece with. Greece needs to act fast, since there are already many leaders that are talking about walking away from Greece if it does not prepare itself to enact serious reforms. The question we are looking to answer in this video is whether or not Greece should exit the Eurozone and create its own currency back again, or should it just cut pension reforms, which are primarily the biggest problem in Greece right now.
It is no secret that Greece has been struggling financially for approximately 7 years. In the 1990s, Greece began having budget deficit with its prior currency, the drachma. Because of these problems, Greece joined the euro in 2001. 2 years later, most of the countries that had changed their currencies to euro. When Greece did this, a period of growth took place. From 2001 to 2007, key economic indicators showed progress and stability. For example, unemployment gradually decreased from 10% in 2001 to 7.7% in 2007, generally being about just 1% higher than most of the other European countries. All this prosperity may have had happened because the European Union loans were cheaper and more profitable for Greece at that time. And in 2008, the global financial crisis affected Greece. Except this time it was different because they were now backed up by the euro. They would normally get out of trouble by just printing more money and boosting the economy, but because this currency was jointed with the whole European Union, they weren't able to one day decide to print more money, since it was controlled by the European Central Bank. In addition to this, it is essential that we understand that Greece had a problem in every one of its administrations. They never truly revealed the actual figures of deficit the country was facing. So in 2009, when they did reveal the true figures, many alarms were raised about Greece's financial stability. In 2010, Greece was on the verge of bankruptcy. This was so important because being part of the European Union, a financial crisis in one country could potentially affect many others in the Union. This deficit period continued, and this same year, the European Central Bank, the IMF, and European Commission started to give loans to Greece in exchange of them making some spending cuts and raising taxes. Greece received the first bailout of $107.3 billion in 2010. When they were forced to cut spending, it obviously didn't go well with people, since Greece's spending involves mostly in pension payments, and this accounts for 17.5% of the GDP, compared with an average of 13% in other European countries. This meant that people's life support was literally going to be cut down, since many households are dependent upon the income from one single pension for survival. Demands only brought up more tension and unemployment, and debt kept increasing and taking an even bigger percentage of the nation's GDP. After the 2010 bailout, international corporations took their money out of the Greek economy because it was now managed by the rich European Union nations instead of private banks. Also, the majority of the funding went to paying off a part of Greece's international loans and debt instead of being injected into the damaged economy. One of the biggest problems is that when Greece did cut off some spending, both the European Union and the European Central Bank also asked for a reduction in wages instead of more cuts in spending. Fast forwarding to July 2015, Greece's government missed a critical debt payment to the International Monetary Fund, reason why banks have been forced to close. And not much later, there was a referendum where the majority of Greeks rejected the European austerity demand that would have meant more financial relief for Greece. At this point, the banks were at the brink of collapsing. Now, the issue was whether Greece should do austerity on its terms or on the terms implanted by the rest of Europe. Europeans recommended Greece to fix the economy by cutting its spending, but instead of that, Greece would rather reduce deficit by raising taxes.
Some people may wonder why Greece just doesn't implement a fiscal policy to get it over with, but as we will explain, it's easier said than done. We now know that during a recession, a government could implement an expansionary fiscal policy to increase government spending and reduce taxation.
The government could also be able to use monetary policy simultaneously, but in the case of Greece, this is not an option.
The problem lies on the fact that the tax collection system is a disaster. Also, government spending accounts for 60% of the GDP. These two are the main reasons why fiscal policy is simply not a viable option for Greece. Besides, Greece violated the regulations of the European Central Bank because its deficit is higher than 3%, when it is a fact that every European Union nation should have a deficit below 3%. If a fiscal policy was possible and successful, the increase in taxes could help pay back loans. As said by an article in Investopedia, Greece's debt problems are not due to extravagant spending by the government, but to insufficient revenues caused by rampant tax evasion. Fiscal policies are left out of the equation because of society evading its responsibilities to contribute and the flawed system that somehow has given corruption an acceptable image. Let's talk about what happens if the European Central Bank doesn't give Greece the money it needs. Greece is left with two options to get that money. The first option would be to take it from depositors, which is a bank bail-in, for example, like the one that happened in Cyprus 3 years ago, when the European Central Bank stopped backing up Cyprus banks. The second option is a bit more tricky. They could print more money. The problem is, Greece has no currency to print. It only has the euro, which is directed back to the European Central Bank since they are a part of the European nations. They could only print more money if they had their own currency, and they could recapitalize by just printing more. Both options have serious consequences, and both are easier said than done. According to the data showed here, provided by the Washington Post, we can see that it is highly beneficial for Greece to use the euro. It allows it to import and export without the complications of changing currency. In July of 2015, a research group from Oxford Economics explained the possibilities of Greece leaving the Eurozone, showing that 85% voted no, but later top banks like JP Morgan Chase and Barclays declared they were actually expecting a Grexit. In our opinion, Grexit is not so profitable. due to the process it would take. First, it would take at least half a year just to change every contract, financial asset, and wage agreement from euro to drachmas. Then, when the banks reopen, the drachma would probably depreciate before finally stabilizing. Meanwhile, the euro coins currently circulating in Greece would increase in value. Finally, the debt would also be converted to drachmas, and the upcoming or current government would have to accept the debt for the interest payments coming in the future. The government would begin a process of moratoriums to declare the interest payments and the debt to the European Central Bank. There are obvious speculations of what the future holds if Greece Grexits. It will most probably continue its path of depression. Sure, there are benefits of exiting the euro, since some people argue that the euro wasn't the best option to begin with years ago. It is difficult to keep so many different ranges of economies stabilized by using the same currency. When a crisis starts, investors abandon countries like Greece and seek for strong economies like one in Germany, for example, leaving Greece in an even bigger mess, stripping it from the few investments it counts with. Here are a few of the key factors to understanding the Greek pension problem. The average retirement age in Greece has been falling for years. Men retire at 62 and women retire at 60, even though the retirement age was recently raised to 67. Greece is the country in the European Union that spends the most amount of money in pensions. It spends more than the double the spending of Estonia, Ireland, and Slovakia. The Prime Minister of Greece said that he does not believe in the new economic measures. Regardless, he said he will have to follow through on them in order to receive a third bailout and avoid bankruptcy in his country. As said before, no other country in the European Union spends the amount that Greece spends on pension, which is 17.5% of its GDP. As a part of package of savings and tax increase, Greece creditors are demanding the government cut pensions by 1% of gross domestic output, a more rapid clampdown on early retirees, and for supplementary pensions to be financed by contributions, not by the state. If the supplementary pensions are financed by contributions and not by the state, it would be effectively cutting them further. What makes the country's pension system unsustainable is not the size of each individual person, but the overall cost the pensions create in the economy. It is an inefficient and badly funded system that is due to the tax evasion, and it is essential to understand that Greece has a problem in every one of its administration. They don't show the true figures of deficit, so people were having a false sense of relief when they joined the Eurozone, thinking that their budget was in check, when it really wasn't. The government continued to manage the country as if everything was okay. But one of the main problems, which we will highlight in this video, is the fact that the public sector wages rose more than the private sector paycheck, and what we believe is the main problem are that pension spending went up. All this with the fact that Greece has a tendency to avoid taxes went out of control when the global financial crisis hit in 2008.